Welcome to The Deep End by On Deck, a podcast for visionary builders, creators, and experts to discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov. Let's dive in.
A lot of the modern technology stack, let's say just building a phone app, is done because we are standing on the platform upon that deep technology had already built. And so really, if you're not at the bleeding edge, I mean, even if you're a little bit farther away, but if you're in the center of the standard deviation of technology, then you're taking what's been done and sort of remixing it a little bit and kind of adding a little bit of spice. But there will come some point where you've tried every variation and every mixture, and you've tried all the things that there are to do. You can imagine every single phone app has been built, and now we need a new paradigm of computing. Whether that is blockchain, whether that's virtual reality, whether that's augmented reality, whatever it is, there will be some point where all the tests, all of the apps have been built for what we imagine a traditional rectangular smartphone to be, in the same way that we did basically all of the things we could have with a mainframe way back in the 1900s.
At The Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in-depth into ideas that inspire people to build. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of internet communities, creator tools, climate tech, longevity, and much, much more. There are no experts in uncharted territory, only pioneers. The Deep End invites these trailblazers to turn their experiences into the knowledge and ideas that others need to start their own founder odysseys. Joining me this week in The Deep End is James Sinka, co-founder of On Deck's Deep Tech program. Some of our past Deep End guests and many On Deck fellows are working at the bleeding edge of technology. So far, we've talked to founders of biotech companies, space manufacturers, carbon solution pioneers, and more. Deep tech is a category of innovation that exists at the intersection of many different fields under the technology umbrella. Modern advancements in computer infrastructure enable new, sophisticated methods of tackling tough problems in the world of atoms. James Sinka joins the show to share how world-class scientists, card-carrying PhDs, and engineers can commercialize their deep knowledge in hyper-specific fields to unlock vibrant futures for humanity. The sophistication of some of these tough technologies might sometimes be thought of as miraculous. If we can master protein folding, for example, we might be able to revolutionize drug design and otherwise heal cells with more ease than we might have ever imagined. This conversation provides a broad overview of deep tech and examples of how the interdisciplinary application of advanced technology can go to market. To learn more about On Deck's Deep Tech program, visit beondeck.com/deeptech. James Sinka, welcome to The Deep End.
Thank you for having me, Marshall. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm good. Good. Happy to be talking to you, man.
So let's get talking to it. So you help run the On Deck Deep Tech Fellowship. We were having a bit of a debate, producer Jackson and I, before we recorded this episode, focusing on terms. Deep tech, hard tech, it's unclear whether these things are the same, whether they're different. This all gets mixed about. So let's just start by defining terms. What is deep tech, and is it at all related to hard tech and those other different definitions that get thrown around?
For sure. So another one that MIT likes to use is tough tech, actually. And in my perspective, they all are scratching at the same itch, which is technology that is non-trivial and requires a substantial amount of de-risking to prove that it's even able to be fully commercialized. So with all the no-code tools that are out there and all of, let's say, the software libraries, creating another file sharing app of any sort, whether it's audio sharing like a podcast or it's photo sharing like an Instagram competitor or what have you, can be done with practically no need for a new technological innovation. And deep tech relies on creating something that, or tough tech or hard tech, that may not even be fully possible yet. So I think Varda is like a classic example of this. We both chatted with Dalian obviously super brilliant team, but it hasn't been proven that you can make additive manufacturing in space feasible at a commercial scale. And
can you, in case any listeners haven't done their homework, can you explain what Varda is doing?
Sure. So Varda is an innovative space manufacturing company that is taking advantage of the unique microgravity environment that you find in space to produce materials and to do types of manufacturing that otherwise wouldn't be able to be done in space. So one small example of that is if you're trying to make really precise molecular pieces of glass that have, so glass is typically a compound like silicon dioxide. They're working on a material called Z-blend glass that has a whole range of dopants and elemental additions to just the traditional silicon dioxide because it improves the material properties. It turns out that it can actually carry light and therefore fiber optic signals way better than traditional glass. So it turns out that these dopants, the additional differentiating elements that makes Z-blend glass different from silicon dioxide traditional glass, those small elements have a natural tendency, just like coffee grounds at the bottom of a cup, to separate based on the gravitational pull that pulls the sedimentation of the coffee down to the very base of the cup. And that's caused by gravity. Now, when you're in a low gravity or no gravity environment, that type of molecular separation doesn't happen. And so you're able to have a far more pure, far more crystalline, far more homogeneous, and so therefore high quality Z-blend glass if it's made in space than you can on Earth. And so the challenge is proving that this can be done repeatedly and in a commercial scale, because the first ever experiment proving Z-blend glass can be made was done on the International Space Station. And so that is a scientific feat in and of itself. So therefore it's a piece of deep technology, but where deep tech really comes at it, or hard tech or tough tech, or however you want to name this space, where it comes to light is taking that process that's been proved to be done at the very small scale and being able to do enough of it to actually support and supply industry. So you can imagine that you need to print miles of this stuff for it to actually make a true dent in the world. Otherwise, it's just a science fair project.
And something I'm curious about, given those three terms that you illustrated, which one, I suspect, because you're running the Deep Tech Fellowship, you're going to move in a specific direction. But what do you think of the three terms? Just because it is interesting in these spaces to see different attempts at defining and branding a space where folks are encountering it for the first time. I would just say outright, I am not a huge fan of tough tech. It sounds a little defensive relative to the other ones, but I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah. So to your point, I also don't like tough tech. And I think hard tech implies hardware, like the two kind of sound synonymous. And there is deep tech that is non-hardware based. So creating novel blockchains, like the Bitcoin breakthrough, was a deep tech innovation. Artificial intelligence on the scale of GPT-3, that's OpenAI's latest available for public use artificial intelligence algorithm, was a deep tech feat. Google's DeepMind algorithms are a feat of deep tech. So because we now in the present world recognize that deep technologies, these very innovative, cutting edge, potentially impossible and not feasible pieces of human ingenuity and innovation aren't just in the world of atoms, but also in the world of bits, in the world of software. They're not just confined to the world of hardware. I think hard tech gives an inappropriate assumption to someone who's not familiar with the space that it automatically means, oh, it's hardware technology. And it's not. It's technology that is at the very bleeding cutting edge of what is even possible. And so you have to learn a lot about it. And so it's deep in its knowledge requirements and how far away it is, let's say, from the traditional accessibility of a normal person or a normal even technologist, that you really do have to be deeply immersed in the field, in the cutting edge to even produce and to synthesize these types of innovations, let alone bring them to market.
And a quick follow-up here. I doubt you literally know this, but just help us conceptualize what Google's DeepMind algorithms are and how that specific part focuses within this deep tech space.
Sure. So Google had a breakthrough innovation in a class of libraries or a publication of these protein folding schemas that they allowed for the public to have for free. And for those that don't know, for those that aren't familiar with biology, proteins are basically the molecular machines that make everything that we know as our bodies and anything that we know biologically. So they're the fact that proteins are basically the small factories of the human body and of the biological world means that they're really important. And the way a protein is made is just by synthesizing a bunch of little bases or base pairs together. You can kind of think about it, you can visualize it and imagine for it to be like a bunch of Lego bricks that are kind of stacked together. And so after you put all these Lego bricks together, what finally is the resultant product has a specific shape and therefore a specific function. And so understanding what the Lego pieces will eventually turn out to be, how they will fold, how they'll interact, how they stack together, was something that we actually didn't have the ability to pre-predict with computer simulations, with artificial intelligence. And so what that means is any time that we would discover something new, or if there was, let's say, a really important protein that affected heart disease or cancer, we had to guess and check our way to figuring out what does this thing even look like? Because when you understand what it looks like, you can start to find targets for therapies or for drugs, so on and so forth. So Google's breakthrough was in developing an algorithm that could reliably, with the data that we had, predict how these proteins would actually fold and therefore what shape they would have. Because again, if you can predict the shape, you can predict the functionality and targets on the shape for therapeutics and for drugs. So one of the things that I think they demonstrated, which is really beautiful and in my opinion, a cornerstone of deep technology and why it's accelerating and now even a category, whereas 2 decades ago, it was really fringe, is because of the intersection of disciplines that are at the cutting edge that actually have a multiplying force when brought together. So in the case of this protein folding DeepMind innovation, they were taking medical data, biological data, advances in artificial intelligence, obviously, and then also in sensing and spectroscopic data. Spectroscopic basically means detection with light. And that's how you check to see, okay, is this the same shape that I thought it was, right? Like you look at the assembly of the Lego pieces and you're like, okay, yeah, this is a house. Like you check to see that it's a house when you're done. And so it's the intersection of innovations in all those separate disciplines that enable you to have an artificial intelligence software or algorithm give you the shape to any protein that would be folded. And in the same way, Varda, as an example, is taking advantage of the space manufacturing company, advances in manufacturing capabilities, advances in materials science, and advances in the ability to not just put cargo up into space, but to bring it back down reliably. And so a decade ago, their company wouldn't have been feasible. In the same way, a decade ago, we wouldn't have had the computing infrastructure. We wouldn't have had all the biological advancements to be able to do the protein folding. And so right now, we're at a precipice where as technology improves in so many different industries, where they intersect is never before an opportunity to see an explosion of new potential companies and technologies that can be done before that in the past just weren't feasible.
And something I'm curious about, because you've done a great job of laying it out. So let's just take a step back and really get to understanding the background here. What's the historical timeline when it's come to deep tech, in the sense that we work at a technology company. We're here at On Deck. If you're looking at the 1990s and 2000s, everything is about the bits, innovating there, attacking a space. When you were talking about how if you are a person in the deep tech space, you have to really have deep knowledge. I'm thinking back to the lines they used to say about Airbnb. They'd never run a hotel before. The people, Travis Kalanick at Uber had never, actually run a taxi cab company. And the point was tech and software were such that if you could code, you could actually improve upon legacy systems. And the question wasn't, do you know how legacy systems were really set up? So can you just help explain how this deep tech space has evolved? And then aside and related question to that is like, who are the type of founders, operators, et cetera, who are best suited to hitting these points where it's not purely just a matter of like your actual ability to code. There's actually like deeper scientific intersections that you're referencing here.
Definitely. So I'll answer the second part first, which is, can we talk about the types of founders and the people that are building deep technology companies? And at the end of the day, what matters in deep tech is if the thing can even be built, because we've seen a very public failure in Theranos that claimed to have a breakthrough technology, but really it was just vaporware. And that was a case of over-optimization in sales and marketing and deception as well. But frankly, an under-optimization in material technological innovation. I think specifically in Theranos' case, they had enough cash on their balance sheet. They were able to raise enough money and spin enough of a vision together that they could have, if it was their primary intention, to pour a lot of money into making this technology feasible, and the people that you hire to be able to mine those experiments, mine those breakthroughs, to first know the space well enough, know where the cutting edge is, and then to use their intuition to say, I hypothesize that if we push in this direction, it might yield some results. And then so to set up those experiments, to run those experiments, to collect the data from those experiments, to say, is this true? Is it not? Did we actually get the result we anticipated? Did we not? And from that, now have a new intuition of what can we do next to de-risk or to further map out what is even physically possible. And then engineeringly feasible would be the following on question. So it does matter tremendously to make sure you have the right scientist, the right engineer, the right technologist on your team if you're going to build a deep technology company. And we now have a prudent example in Elon Musk of what it can be done to spin out or to want to commercialize a vision that you have. So Elon wasn't necessarily, let's say, a rocket engineer, but he hired and worked with rocket engineers and learned from them. And because he himself had an engineering mindset, he could put himself at the cutting edge by talking to these folks. And through doing that, create his own hypotheses, create his own tests that he wanted to run, alongside obviously enabling the people who knew what they were doing to run their own. But unlike starting another, let's say, commodities goods product that just has a fresh brand on it, no amount of marketing and sales and I would say the other business showmanship aspects, the soft skills, will actually be able to make a rocket fly or be able to allow you to 3D print an organ on a satellite that's orbiting Earth. So it's the hard skills that really make the difference. And at the end of the day, what modern, I don't want to say modern, but regular technology is doing, so non-deep tech, is leveraging technology that once used to be deep tech and is now no longer because it's everywhere. So if you think about it, the first ever smartphone required a fundamental innovation in computing, in mobile technologies, in sensor packing, so on and so forth. And so the first ever iPhone was a piece of deep tech. Now we take cell phones basically for granted. And so a lot of the modern technology stack, let's say just building a phone app, is done because we are standing on the platform upon that deep technology had already built. And so really, if you're not at the bleeding edge, I mean, even if you're a little bit farther away, but if you're in the center of the standard deviation of technology, then you're taking what's been done and sort of remixing it a little bit and kind of adding a little bit of spice. There will come some point where you've tried every variation and every mixture, and you've tried all the things that there are to do. You can imagine every single phone app has been built, and now we need a new paradigm of computing. Whether that is blockchain, whether that's virtual reality, whether that's augmented reality, whatever it is, there will be some point where all the tests, all of the apps have been built for what we imagine a traditional rectangular smartphone to be, in the same way that we did basically all of the things we could have with a mainframe way back in the 1900s, or the telegram, right? Like no matter how good of a telegram operator or programmer you were, you could never send virtual images, right, through a telegram. It just would not work. So,
and even if you could, that was not the right way to direct energy.
No, it wasn't. So I think one thing that some people take for granted is deep technology, when it fully becomes commercialized and goes mainstream, becomes everyday technology, and we don't even recognize that it's different. And that bar, or that evenly distributing that future to everyone, is the goal of all deep technology. It's to become not such a niche factor. Like even if you think about it, X-rays, when they were first discovered in the 1900s, they're now a routine part of any kind of an injury that someone gets if they break a bone or if they go to the dentist and whatnot. But at a certain point, like, we didn't even understand what X-rays were. And so harnessing the potential of that science, of that engineering, enabled medicine to take a unprecedented personalized aspect where you could now target the place in someone's arm where they had broke it, instead of just saying like, well, we're just going to take some pieces of wood together and duct tape. They didn't have duct tape back then, right? They would take, I guess, some wire, some twang and just hope that it fixed it, you know? So for the types of founders, you definitely want technical people who have a understanding of what could be, and who aren't, let's say, brittle in their assumptions, but are willing to have that growth mindset of saying, let's try out a bunch of different things, and be humble about the fact that when you run the experiment, you might not get the data that you want, but you're willing to iterate and you're willing to pivot on that information.
I like your retelling of the Theranos story, because it raises an issue that applies to all of deep tech outside of just the pure Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes problems, which is, in these technically sophisticated areas, a line that folks will point out when it comes to people who attempt to use the story of Theranos as a story about Silicon Valley is they point out, hey, look, everyone's serious in the space past. And if anything, the tale of Elizabeth Holmes is her finding smart but completely unrelated folks, Henry Kissinger, wealthy families, East Coast money, etc., who was entranced by that vision but lacked the technical expertise to know that this wouldn't work, unlike basically most of the usual suspects in Silicon Valley. So how, from both directions, should one think about, if you, let's say you're an investor, evaluating whether or not this thing, which hasn't quite happened yet, is viable or not? How should you, as an early stage employee who isn't going to have that high degree of scientific expertise as the founder, as the first scientist, etc., how should you think of that part? And then thirdly, I'm throwing too many questions to you, but I think you could pull this together. Okay. What is the balance between these deep, hard problems and the need to be optimistic? Because the key thing in the Elizabeth Holmes story is that the first professor she takes this to says, oh, this just can't be done. Mm-hmm. And to a certain degree, Elizabeth Holmes would probably be much better off if she just said, okay, cool, I'm going to go finish Stanford and not do that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there was a company, there was something. So how do you balance those two dynamics together in areas where there's not quite as much danger of grift?
Absolutely. So any scientist worth their salt, even if they don't have data showing you that it does work because they're hypothesizing that they haven't necessarily run the experiments. They could tell you what experiment they're going to run, what the assumptions are behind that experiment, why that experiment will lead or should generate the type of results. And they can explain really the mechanism behind which all of these factors would enable the result that you're looking for. So let's say in the case of Theranos, we actually know nowadays, based on folks that have come up and told their stories around the early days. So one person that comes to mind is Peter Attia, who's a doctor who focuses on longevity medicine. Back in 2006, he was approached by Elizabeth through a mutual friend to be the chief medical officer for the company. And he went so far as to sign an NDA to talk about the interview. And she brought out the Edison box, which is the device that they had at the time, during the interview and discussed, its capabilities. And she was trying to bring him on as their chief medical officer. And he asked, okay, great. I've signed the NDA. We're completely under wraps. Happy to sign more if I have to. Can I look inside the box? And can you show me how this thing works? And she refused. And so when you're at the proximity where you're trying to be one of the chief X officers of a company, you should be able to see how the sausage is made. You should be able to pull back the curtain and see what's going on. And so maybe if you're not at the advanced enough stage where you have, let's say, a device or a prototype, that scientist, that engineer should at least be able to walk you up to a whiteboard and say, these are the assumptions we are basing our technology off of. So again, to take the case of Varda, the International Space Station has already shown that under the experience of microgravity, new types of materials that have never been able to be made before can be produced. And so the question becomes, okay, well, what are the other modes of failure? If this thing didn't work, why would it not work? It turns out one of those factors is actually bringing the material back down to Earth in a price-sensitive way. So I think something Dalian likes to talk about is how the Dragon capsule that brings astronauts back down is this really nice, made for humans, sort of like a limousine type thing. Whereas really all you need to bring materials back down to be like a small canister. And so you don't need as much like life support. You don't need oxygen, temperature stabilization, all that kinds of stuff. So the question is, can you create a device that'll bring it back down that is able to do so profitably? And if anyone at that company was unwilling to tell me what method of attack they at least were going to consider, huge, massive red flag. So that's absolutely, from an investor side, from an employee side, ask, how is this going to work? Or what are you pressing on? What type of factor are you attacking? What's your attack vector that you can go out and check? So it's undisputable that a lot of people will tell you why things won't work. And it's your job as the founder to go collect the data that points to why this could work, or to state assumptions that can then be tested or be falsified of what makes this even in the realm of possibility. So we know, as an example, that because of wonderful work done by Albert Einstein, that if you travel close to the speed of light, your clock relative to the time on Earth slows down significantly. And so theoretically, at least without breaking the laws of physics, you could extend people's lives by bringing them close to the speed of light. So like if someone was pitching you on a company of life extension by bringing people close to the speed of light, you wouldn't have to ask the question, oh, is this even possible by the realm of physics? Because you can point to equations that would show why it would be. The question you would ask is, how are you going to get people moving close to that speed of light? And so then they would need to talk about what the reasonable way for them to do that would be. Because it turns out that modern rockets we have cannot produce that level of acceleration. And then, so let's say they were magically able to produce a rocket that could accelerate you really, really quickly. Then you would say, well, how would the human being survive under all that accelerative G-force? right? And so you could kind of go through the process of unbundling and unboxing and testing all of the assumptions. And then at the end of the day, it's true. You kind of have to take a leap of faith to say, well, I think that there's a reasonable chance that we could overcome that one thing. Or you could say, hey, I'm willing to join the company once you run this experiment and prove to me that this is the case or not. So in the case of, let's say, a prestigious scientist, they'll say, hey, I'll even advise or run the experiment for you, right? To prove if this thing can even be done. And if it can't, like, good luck. You need to figure out a new method of attack. And if it can't be done, well, yeah, you have a Theranos on your hands. So I always say, be wary when people can't explain their why, and when people can't go up to the whiteboard and give you that detailed breakdown, because it's a bad sign that if you as the person being hired are like, wow, this seems mystical, and someone else that is theoretically even more senior than you can't give you a good answer, then they're probably full of hot air.
Earlier in the episode, you made a reference to the world of bits and atoms, which is basically a reference to this idea that we could be in the middle of a type of technological stagnation where we have, as a society, been able to innovate when it comes to software, bits, but not been particularly effective at developing in the world of atoms since effectively the 1970s. What do you think about that broad debate? Is the fact that we're even having this conversation suggesting we're turning a corner? How do you just think about the broad mechanics of that? Because the essay which this all came out with and was referencing is now almost 10 years old. So obviously things have happened between now and then.
I would absolutely say that things have happened between now and then. I mean, we've created the first mRNA vaccine and delivered it to millions of people. So we know that there can still be innovations that happen in the physical world. And in that, I believe Peter Thiel has a really solid point of view on this when he says that regulation is actually holding us back here, because one of the beautiful pieces about working in software is you don't need much permission to do practically anything. And as you can see with the shipping delays, there are some archaic regulations around how many containers you can stack that Ryan from Flexport was actually able to do a really detailed outline of and get the regulation, I believe it was in the long port of LA, to be changed in order to accommodate for being able to stack these cargo containing boxes taller than too tall. For whatever reason, it was just like an arbitrary regulation that had gotten there. And so arbitrary regulations have a lot to put barriers in the way of the ability to innovate. And I think that has huge ramifications in terms of founders' willingnesses to engage in those more difficult places to work in. So I'll give you myself as an example. I worked in the synthetic cannabinoid space. We actually had a startup where we were creating novel cannabinoids that had never existed in California. And a space that was even more interesting to me was actually the space of novel psychedelics, like, let's say, psilocybin or LSD analogs that could be used and are now being shown with FDA breakthrough status are really beneficial for mental health, in particular PTSD. But we didn't want to touch that space for fear of all the regulation, all the red tape, all the difficulty of getting involved. I mean, when there's a chance that you could go to jail for working on something, that turns a lot of people off from working on that space, right? So that happens to be a pretty extreme case, but you could imagine that doing any kind of innovation where there's a lot of regulation becomes unnecessary friction, because it's hard enough to make something that is unique, that's novel, that has never existed before. So adding even more clauses and cases to that, it further disincentivizes said innovation. I actually think New York, when they passed the BIT license, was a great example of that, where New York said, like, hey, if you want to do any kind of crypto trading or any kind of novel crypto mechanisms here, you're going to have a license that enables you to do that. And as a result, the companies said, actually, no, thank you. And they all left New York. And New York is now blacklisted as a place where none of these if you're a resident of New York, you don't have access to a lot of these cryptocurrency offerings or services, because they don't want to have to comply with the local regulation. And so you can imagine if the US as a whole adopted that, then we would just put ourselves at the last of the bottom of the list for this new type of innovation. So I think there needs to be a very delicate line that's balanced between regulation and innovation, because regulation halts innovation. But I also understand the other side if you don't want people selling snake oil and claiming that it's a cure for cancer when really it harms people. So I see both sides of that argument. And when we have states of extreme need, we've proven that science can come together and deliver extraordinary feats, like again with the COVID vaccine. And so if we created, let's say, if we were able to safely fast track a COVID vaccine, then in my mind, there's no reason why we can't increase the pace of any biological innovation that needs to go through the FDA. Right? If we did it for COVID, we should do it for all kinds of cancer treatments and Alzheimer's treatments, so on and so on and so on. So I think regulation is a big piece. On the other hand, I will admit that a lot of the technologies, let's say at the base root of physics, are very hard to commercialize or make use of, right? So we've discovered, as an example, the Higgs boson. But what can you really do with the discovery of the Higgs boson? Like, yes, it was a fundamental innovation in the world of physics, but it's not like we can make faster, as far as I know of, we can't make faster cell phones, cheaper electronics or anything like that with the discovery of the Higgs boson. So it doesn't translate. These scientific discoveries don't necessarily always translate over to technological innovations. What I will say, though, is again, it's the intersectionality between new technologies or different places on the cutting edge that enable things to be done that in the past never were. And so, two interesting pieces, in my opinion, is the use of artificial intelligence for chemistry and for material science. In the same way that, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, if you take silicon dioxide, which is traditionally glass, and you add the right dopants in it, you make this really special Z-bland glass. Imagine if we could compute basically any kind of material you use on our daily basis, and we could just imagine what would happen if you sprinkled a little bit of hydrogen, a little bit of helium, every single thing down the periodic table. We could create new materials we've never been able to imagine before. And so I think software is enabling us to do more with less in the world of atoms. And that's really exciting.
Speaking of doing more with less, I'm really interested, and this relates to your background in deep tech, around how the funding investment structure works here. So with your previous company, you went through YC, but what's interesting about everything you're describing here is you're making references to risk, unclear whether things would pay off. This isn't just a situation where, once again, you write the right code and put in the right amount of hours, attacking the right industry with the right total addressable market, and you could create a unicorn here. The story isn't quite as easy to tell. So can you describe what the funding ecosystem looks like? And then frankly, when it comes to investors, what story are you telling when you're in a YC interview? Are you telling when you're looking at people who are used to funding SaaS companies? How should we just think of all this together?
Yeah. So actually, I think that there's too many SaaS investors out there and not enough deep tech investors relatively for one to the next, because that's like saying, can you have someone who's worked in science explain to you why we should be using Ethereum instead of Solana? It's like they would still have to do their own research about cryptocurrency to figure out like which one of these is better and why. That being said, I think there is a lot of general principles that are relevant across the board for many different types of startups, whether you're in SaaS, whether you're in deep tech or something else completely. And that is a lot to do with the story that you tell about the world as it is today, or the world as it's been thus far, and then the future that will be so much brighter as a result of your technology existing. That storytelling you cannot forego, no matter how incredible your technology is, because at the end of the day, you still have to captivate an audience. You have to captivate someone and talent to work for you. You have to captivate an investor to want to invest in you. You have to captivate customers to listen to you, give you the light of day and say, hey, even though, because generally as a startup, your first sale is usually the most expensive. And then it kind of goes down from there as you have more word of mouth, you reach economies of scale, so on and so forth. You need to captivate the minds of people that say, actually, even though this is more expensive than maybe I would pay for it, I believe in the mission. And so we're going to go for it. And that's what Tesla did with the Roadster, right? Like it was a very sexy car that was sporty and fun to drive. And they were paying a premium for it, but ultimately they liked the vision of electrification, and they thought the car was a fun experience. So they were willing to pay a premium for it. That the story that they were telling was an important one. That cars can be fun to drive and not be harmful for the environment, right? Now, I think the funding environment in today's economy is an interesting one, where we're seeing valuations at an all-time high. And we're seeing the clip of funding of investors raising capital and deploying capital, again, at all-time highs. And I think that that's actually an enabling forcing function for deep tech companies more than ever, because no matter who you are, no matter what company you're working on, if you're the absolute best in your field, even if we were to have an economic depression or a recession, if Stripe was to go raise or SpaceX was to go raise, they would be able to raise money.
Yes.
Right? There's like no question about that. The question is, like, if you're a first-time founder and your story is maybe not so great and the team isn't really able to put that together, like, are you worth that risk? Are you going to be the 10th out of 10 investment? Because, I could just like YOLO the capital. It's not really a big issue. So the ability for a founder who might not have as much experience to get themselves to sort of punch a little bit above their weight is beneficial in this type of a funding environment where there is so much capital available. And so the other factor is, if you imagine that the average fundraise post-money valuation at the seed stage, if you look at what that's been over the years, when I went through Y Combinator, that was between 10 to 12. Nowadays, it looks like it's between 15 to, in some cases, 25. So if you imagine a standard amount of dilution, let's say we just compare 10 to 20, and you were going to sell 10% of your company, that would mean you get $1 million versus $2 million. You can do a surprising amount of cutting edge research with $2 million and reserving more of your company for follow-on funding than you could with $1 million. And that might seem kind of arbitrary, but in the case of science, actually being able to get a lab that will able to meet your requirements, being able to hire the right people. I mean, if you think about hiring 3 to 5 senior level scientists, if you pay them $200K a year, that's $600K to $1 million in salaries. That's right there. You haven't even factored in your materials. You haven't factored in your rent of the lab space, everything like that. Like, it's the difference between 1 and 2 mil is actually game changing and life producing or life breaking in this case. So because there is more and more capital out there, because more capital wants to find really good talent, the macro environment is such that deep tech is more fundable than ever. And I actually really like Balaji's line where he goes, the level above professor is now founder, because while professors have to scrape for 100K grants year after year after year, a really good founder can tell a compelling story, get 2 mil, absolutely execute like they would like a professor, work that 80 to 100 hour a week for a year, 2 years, and then get the next $5 to $10 million round. And all of a sudden, they've kind of broken through this tyranny of needing to go through the public funding cycle of writing papers and grants and whatnot. And instead, they get to focus all that energy on executing and proving out that the technology works. So I think it's a great time to be a deep tech founder. And I think investors need to continue to do the things that they do, which is diligence the team, diligence the progress, but then also, have faith in the technologies that you think will make a difference. Because at the end of the day, no matter how good a startup is doing now, it doesn't guarantee future success, right? Past performance does not guarantee future success, no matter what. It's all risky at the end of the day. And if as an investor, you can't tolerate risk, well, then you don't deserve necessarily the benefits of yield, right? Go invest in bonds.
And speaking of founders, in this last bit here, I'm on the page of the Deep Tech Fellowship, and there's actually a pretty good summary slash pointing to of the different areas that you all are involved in the fellowship. So what I'd really love you to do here is just, I'll give you an example. Life sciences, for example, would love to get your definition of that space in the deep tech context. What is a company or a founder you're excited about? We basically did this with space already with Varda, so we'll skip that one. But let's just go down the line, cover all of our bases here. So life sciences.
Absolutely. Definitely. So life sciences is basically, we categorize them as any company that deals with or enables biology. And that is such a broad definition that you can put in, therapeutics companies, you can put in companies that do biological detection, and everything under the sun. But I would say one of my favorite companies in the space is Resistance Bio, and the founder is named Nick. And Nick Goldner has their company is taking cancerous tissues from patients, putting them on a petri dish, and multiplying them, growing them in a way that they can take that cancer and do accelerated growth on it to see which different directions that cancer can mutate on. So if you take cancer of, let's say, the brain, and you can see, okay, let's try different types of drugs on it to see which will be effective, which won't be. We'll try radiation, we'll try this proteomics drug, we'll try this small molecule. You can then discover what is the best line of defense and or what kind of new mutations are going to come down the line if you do, let's say, chemotherapy or you do small molecules. And in doing so, you can deliver or bring up to light what the best possible line of attack should be for that one person's medicine, and increase the likelihood that they survive. Because one thing that I think folks may not appreciate is that, especially in biology, there is so much of an evolutionary process that has randomness in it, and science in general, that you just kind of have to try stuff and see what the result's going to be. You can't really preordain or predict exactly where things are going to line up. And so in this case, like, I'm super excited that instead of, that patient just saying like, hey, let's try chemotherapy because I want to roll the dice, they can actually personalize this medicine for you.
Next, we've got energy.
Energy. Okay. So I think energy is pretty pretty straightforward. Basically, the production of any kind of electrons, typically energy. And one of my favorite companies in this space is a company called Commonwealth Fusion Systems, and they're proving for the first time ever that you can use low temperature superconductors, low temperature instead of being like ultra low temperature. These superconductors can be cooled down at liquid nitrogen temperature, and liquid nitrogen is roughly the same cost per gallon as milk. Whereas like traditionally, superconductors would need to be cooled down to liquid helium temperature. And that's like, liquid helium is very, very expensive. Helium is a hard material to get because it's so inert. Anyways, so they have proven that using low temperature superconductors, they can deliver a stronger magnetic force for less energy to contain the fusion plasma that goes around in creating a fusion reactor. And so through the basic engineering that they've shown, creating one of these coils, they've been able to draw a through line and predict that they can actually create fusion reactions that would deliver net positive energy. And if we could get fusion to happen and produce net positive energy, it would be an unlock in terms of energy capability that would make fossil fuels practically irrelevant.
Next, we have hardware-enabled platforms.
Hardware-enabled platforms. So hardware-enabled platforms for me, it hits a warm spot because that was my first startup. And there is so much that you can do with cutting-edge hardware these days, where because of all the innovations we've had in the semiconductor industry, we can take advantage of those etching, those processing techniques. And one of my favorite companies that's doing this is SiFox, which stands for silicon photonics. And Mike Dubrovsky, the founder of the company, is that they've created a very brilliant silicon stack that allows you to basically take the same kind of semiconductor hardware that is used to make the chips in people's phones and whatnot, which can be done at very, very high scale. So we're talking like tens of millions of these chips being produced on a monthly basis. And by binding onto them very selective antibodies, and antibodies are basically like the other side of a puzzle piece to your specific target. So you can imagine there's COVID and there's COVID antibodies. These antibodies specifically detect for COVID. They can, on a chip, detect the presence of a specific biological material. So they have so far produced a COVID test, and their platform implies, and right now they're working on being able to detect all kinds of other things in the presence of the human body, just simply on a chip. And so they're able to do something, they're able to manifest a vision that actually looks kind of similar to Theranos, where with a single drop of blood, you can do all these different measurements. But because we understand how this technology specifically works, they're not making the same claims as Theranos, because you're not going to do, let's say, as an example, like white or red blood count, but you could do like how much insulin or how much glucose does someone have, or how much testosterone, cortisol, dopamine, so on and so forth is in anyone's blood at any given time. I'm very excited to be able to have for everyone a continuous detection of your body and the biochemistry that's going on inside of it 24/7.
And we pretty much covered the manufacturing and machine learning bits of this in the earlier part of the episode. So this is a great place to just really take us out. James, what's the call to action here? Not just for your on deck context, but also just for other folks who are incredibly scientifically literate as you are and who are interested in, once again, I actually really like the biology example you gave, because that's an example of folks who wouldn't traditionally see themselves as founders or having this path actually being able to really make a big impact in a way they weren't before.
Absolutely. So what I would say to anyone that is deep tech curious and interested in deep tech is just get involved. No matter how it is, your ability to do and understand deeply technical concepts is the limiting factor here. There are so many people in all kinds of different companies that are yearning for impact, whether these be software engineers working at big FAANG companies, folks that are in really good operational roles, or let's say marketing or capital deployment roles at investment banks. At the end of the day, we're starting to realize more and more as a generation that time is the thing that you can never get back and is the most important factor. And so if you can take your research and explain it to someone who may not see it the same way as you, they don't have the same scientific literacy, you can inspire them to see what the future of the world looks like enabled by science. And in that way, capture some of the innate imagination and curiosity that's inside of every single person. And slowly and surely, more and more people will be turned on to the idea and the importance of science. Like it was really, really important, as an example, back in the Cold War era. Like scientists were absolutely heralded and loved. And that's possible again today if you believe what you're doing is important, and you don't have to second guess yourself, right? You are the limiting factor. If you can be scientifically literate and scientifically inspired, you can do practically anything else. Anything else is more easily learnable than the skills that it took, the research that you had to do to go get a PhD or a master's or whatever project it was. So believe in yourself and get involved. Speak out about the things that you're working on, the things you're passionate about, and allow other people to get inspired, and they will follow in the vision of what the future could look like that's fully enabled by science.
Really well said. James, thank you so much for joining us in the deep end.
It was a pleasure, Marshall.